There's about 35,000 of us guys out here at Mare Island. We're working 24 hours a day, fixing up busted ships and building new ones. Talk about your total war effort. Brother, we got it here at Mare Island.
Hello, everybody. I'm Justin Crosley.
I'm Ryan Gibbons.
And Kent Fortner.
And this is episode 3 of Battleships to Beer, 10 years of Mare Island Brewing Company. And today, we get to talk about the Coal Shed Brewery, the actual Mare Island Brewery. But first, a beer.
Yeah, you know, it only is fitting to open our Coal Shed Stout.
Nice.
Funny enough, this is also one of the first 4 beers we started, not originally brewed in the Coal Shed, but it definitely was the impetus to make sure we had a brewery in that beautiful space that we had. You know, the stout that we made, it's an oatmeal stout, 6.7%. And, you know, one of the things about stouts I find, especially from a customer's perspective, is they always expect them to be bitter and aggressive. And I've definitely tasted stouts that are bitter and aggressive, but it's just because somebody put too much dark malt into it to try to get that color. And hopefully with this guy here, it actually has been a pretty good crowd pleaser, and I've turned some people onto it.
Super friendly.
Yeah, way friendly.
Well, first of all, I'm glad you didn't try to do something silly like a Coal Shed Pale Ale. It had to be a stout.
No, it had to be.
But then you're right. They shouldn't be acrid. They shouldn't be bitter. And they should sort of dispel the myth that dark beers have to be bitter beers. Or even that dark beers have to be high alcohol beers.
Exactly.
Folks at home, the lowest alcohol beer you will often find at your neighborhood pub is a Guinness, believe it or not.
That is true.
Yeah,
that is true. It's dark but friendly.
That's right, dark but friendly. Absolutely, like a good stout should be. So, as I mentioned, today we get to talk about the Coal Shed Brewery, and it's a very literal term when you guys call it the Coal Shed Brewery. So let's start there.
Well, these are 9 buildings that are identical. They originally were open air, they were open sides, and they were literally put there to house the coal for the steamships that the Navy had at the time. Interestingly, the coal often came from the East Coast or from Europe because it's denser coal than what we find out west. So it would be brought around the Horn, dumped off in the we're talking 1898 to 1906, dropped off and put under the coal shed, and then loaded onto the ships as they came to recoal. And as I think you mentioned, last episode, Teddy Roosevelt's Great White Fleet, when it was going around the world, stopped and coaled at the coal sheds, which is like a cool piece of history on the whole thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so and I don't mean to jump ahead, but I'm just already surprised that you're able to house a brewery in what used to be a coal shed. And especially in the state of California, you know, the environmental leaders that we are. I say that only half sarcastically. The other half is truthfully.
Yeah.
Do you see what I'm getting at already?
Absolutely.
That I'm surprised that you're even able to do this. So there must have been some great amount of cleanup, and we don't have to jump ahead that far, but I'm already surprised that that's where a brewery is.
Well, you know, interestingly, those regulations also are part of what made this happen, because the coal shed is a National Historic Landmark, and so it can't be demolished. And when the developer got finished, because they did the outside, the developer did, we did the inside. When the developer got finished, I remember them saying, we could have knocked this thing down and rebuilt it 4 times for the cost of what it took us to do this. But they were obligated because it's a National Historic Landmark. Now, you're right. I think there was like 16 regulatory bodies, if I was counting it right, that
Wow.
came and signed off on this when it all happened. Luckily, we were never like a center for nuclear or anything that was really questionable, because it was just coal back in the day, and then they cemented that over eventually, and then this was just a series of basically shipwrights that would work on the ships over the years. But it was no small feat. It was done in conjunction with the developer, and basically they claimed they had the budget to do all 9 of these. We were going to be the very first sort of cornerstone tenant. We worked out a lease rate with them. They were going to do the outside. We were going to do the inside. It seemed like a pretty simple, straightforward deal. We, shook hands and signed on the dotted line on the whole thing, and then launched into what is probably the longest couple years of my life, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, we even had to go through the historical commission just to make sure that we could have a brewery in there because of what it was, and they approved it.
I did a shell build here at the Hop Grenade, which, if you don't know, essentially, so nothing to do with the outside, but we completely gutted the inside, including the floor. And I would never do that again. And I had to deal with, I don't know, maybe 3 regulatory agencies, in that build. So adding in the historical part about it's a darn good thing that you guys are so passionate about the history and the location to put up with that. But you did say it was probably the longest 2 years of your life. So
it was. I mean, it was there was some really great parts of it. I mean, we found this cistern from the late 1800s out in the parking lot that was made of brick, and we had to stop everything and get an archaeologist out there, a historical archaeologist, to kind of look at it. I mean, we had a number of things that we kind of went to, but we knew where this was going eventually. We knew it was on the waterfront. We knew it was going to be a cool piece of history. It was the right size. We had been in there before as kind of a warehouse. Now, it was a pretty shady spot when we were in there, but we saw the vision. I mean, I will say they had said they were going to do the other 8 right after us. And there's kind of half of the next one's done, and then they stopped. And so it's been, since 2017, 2018 that we've just kind of been down there trying to make our own weather for the most part. So it hasn't gotten finished up yet, but we totally saw the vision in the whole thing.
What did it look like when you went? I mean, I'm picturing coal soot everywhere, or was that long gone by now?
No, when we were in there, the one thing about the Navy is they had the money to just do what they wanted, and there was feet and feet of concrete as a floor, but there was not much structure to it, so it was broken up concrete all around.
Oh wow!
It was really dark, no windows really, and just a roll-up door. I remember that it took 45 minutes just to get it halfway up to get our truck in and out.
Okay,
and that was definitely one of the things I said. We're getting an automatic door opener for the new one. But one of the things that that helped wag the dog here is we had this beautiful beer called the Coal Shed Stout, and damn if we couldn't get our brewery in there, and we did what we could to make it happen.
Well, and just as a reminder, so you guys were already brewing beer. You had the tap room across on the mainland at the Vallejo Ferry Terminal, and so you already, just want everyone to know, so you already had this Coal Shed Stout. You just didn't have a Coal Shed brewery yet.
Correct.
Okay.
It was always kind of in the plans, was like, we are going to do that eventually, and I think we touched on this in the very first episode. The bank made it possible for us, the local community bank.
Yeah.
And, we went after it. And I will say the developer, even though they didn't finish the rest of it, and certainly there was some hiccups and everything else, they ponied up in a big way to do the outsides and get the parking lot to where we could use it and everything else. And we really got integrated in with the developer and doing all this because, we had to find out where their connections were coming in and where ours was going to exit the building. And we found you're talking about a floor. Mm-hmm. We went to the building department and we said, hey, this is what we want to put in here. And they said, well, where you're putting the tanks, you're going to need to pour whole new concrete because you've got to have seismic uplift, resistant and all this different stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Like, we get it. Well, there's a whole nother half. We're like, well, we're not going to put anything major over there. Can we just leave the existing concrete floors? Because they'd be fine. And that would have been a really inexpensive solution to all that.
Sure.
And they said, well, you can, but only if it has rebar in it. And we're like, well, how exactly do we figure out if it has rebar in it? And so we called this guy, got the name through the developer, and he basically has an ultrasound machine kind of on a stick, almost like a pet on the end of a leash.
Like a skateboard.
Okay.
Yeah. So Ryan and I are standing down at one end, and he basically just walks down the floor with this device on the floor, and he's pausing at certain points. And I'm like, Ryan, that's a good sign. He's stopping. Maybe he's finding something. He goes down, he comes back, stops at the same point, comes back, and I'll never forget. He was like, yeah, there's no rebar here. And I was like, man, do you realize that was like a $40,000 statement that you just made right there or whatever? Because, how are we going to deal with this? Yeah, it was way more than that.
And he just casually says, what he really said is, you're screwed.
Yeah. That's the translation. Yeah. And then we're like, well, where was that little pause, that little hesitation that you did? He's like, well, about 6 to 8 inches in the concrete down is about a 2-inch wide piece of steel that seems to run all the way from what is our windows towards the waterfront, perpendicular to the waterfront back. And 18 inches over is another one. And if you go down a foot and over a foot, there's 2 more. They're very uniform over there. And we're like, huh. And this is, as you've come to understand as we've done these podcasts, we're constantly trying to figure out what is this? Where'd this come from?
Why?
I'm looking at records and
who done it.
So we came up with this theory, kind of in conjunction with the foundation, that it was a narrow gauge railroad where they might put shovel the coal into it, and then that would take it the last, 20 yards, 30 yards down to the waterfront to be put onto the ships. So we were given tours back then, and we were like, I was like, next week on a tour, I was like, hey, we think we found a little narrow gauge railroad that would go out there. And there was this guy, an old timer, and he was like, that's not a narrow gauge railroad. And I'm like, okay. And he's like, I know exactly what it is. I'm like, what is it? And he's like, well, this is all infill. And the way this infill is held in place is there's a metal and wood combination quay wall, which separates the water from the seawall. And that quay wall is held in place by these thick 2-inch metal cables that go underneath all the way back and into bedrock back thing. And the crazy part is he's telling me the story. And I'm like, that's really cool. And then I'm thinking, we were about a day and a half away from digging up all that concrete, and we were going to sever those cables.
Oh.
And I just have this vision of the quay wall just tipping into the water.
Yeah, I wasn't putting that together. Oh.
And so I'm like, oh my God. And I mean, to add to all this, we had, there was you kind of got to picture this, it's hard on a podcast, but there was a sewer line that ran along the water. And we were told to dig out everything and tilt it towards the water so that all our effluent could run into that sewer line and be taken off the island.
Okay.
Then we discovered that sewer line was crushed and it hadn't really worked for years. And so the developer was getting ready to dig up that sewer line. Well, if they did so, they were also going to dig up all these metal cables over the top of it and possibly topple the quay wall into the water.
Incredible.
And so they couldn't do that. And we had to abandon that. And we had to retilt all of our plumbing back towards the other side. And to the developer's credit, I think it was about $500,000. They installed a giant pit and a sump pump and all this stuff for all our effluent to go out the other side and get pumped out the other direction. So these were the kind of things that we ran into. And honestly, that would have sunk us. I mean, that was so much money. And to the developer's credit, they're like, nah, we realize this is something you can't do, and we have to fix this for all the coal sheds. We'll just get in there. But, that's another 2 months, 3 months.
And that's when they found the cistern as well back there. And so that paused and made it go longer as well.
But none of that would have happened without this one person who had some historical knowledge about what was there.
Correct.
You would have practically ruined the spot your brewery is now.
And look at us now.
So, okay, I have so many questions. So you couldn't knock up the floor at all?
Well, no, we eventually figured out a way to basically pick up the floor because we know where these cables are.
Okay.
And so we basically bring up the floor and carefully pour around these cables. But when we brought up the floor, I'll never forget. I think I was actually
you were still at work at your other job at Tricycle Wine Company, I believe it was. And one of the things I always said is I was like, man, it would just be so cool when we break up this floor if we found a piece of coal, just one piece of coal.
Okay,
it'd be awesome.
Yeah.
And so this was the time where I had since left my other job. This was full time, and so I was like, I'm going to be there when the excavators busting through the floor. And so they get down, and I'm around it, and they get down to dirt. And then it starts going down, and then all of a sudden, boop, boop, this chunk of coal comes out, and I was like, "Oh my God, there it is! That's the one!" And I pick it up, I'm taking pictures of it. I'm like, "Kent, you got to get down here! You got to get down here!" And so I think you left work early or whatever, and rushed over, and we're taking selfies with this piece of coal and everything, and it was awesome. And then you went back home, and a couple minutes later, another piece of coal. I'm like, "There's some more," and he's like, "Okay, take some pictures." And then come to find out, there was a whole strata of where that last had coal on it that was just black dust, and these big chunks of coal were coming out. And so they
just poured over that at some point in time?
Poured over it, and feet of concrete, and just
with no
encased
rebar.
It with no rebar.
Right.
Definitely no rebar. And so we actually have preserved some of these big chunks of coal where we shellacked them so you can touch them, feel them, they don't break apart.
Oh, nice.
But you're definitely not finding these down at your local Home Depot. So it came out of our coal shed.
We have boxes of coal.
Easy.
So this sort of answers my question too. So the Navy did come in and clean up, but they cleaned up in their own way, which partly was there was no coal to be seen, but it was all just poured over and done in that way. And what about the walls and the ceiling? Because now they're beautiful. The wood is fantastic. Was that all just covered in soot?
So that was actually part of how we were able to build the brewery there, was that the historical aspect of it was not the walls. It was the eye line of it, the kind of turtle-humped roof of it, and the original member structures that was holding that up.
Okay.
Because before, again, it had coal in there. It kind of needed to breathe a bit, so it didn't have walls on it at the time. It was after they were coal sheds, the Navy put walls on it and repurposed them, used them for different things. So we just maintained that structure, and then the developer tore down all the walls and redid the roofs, and then put that back together, and we built the inside after that. So the funny thing in the walls, though, is when they were tearing down the walls, the Navy would just do layers over layers of walls. Instead of maybe fixing something, they would just fortify it a little more.
Sure.
As we were peeling back those layers, we found these beautiful old window panes. A couple of them were broken out, but if you come to the Coal Shed Brewery now, we saved them and preserved them, and they are now framing between the bar and the brewery. There's two framed windows that were just stuck in the walls at some point in time.
Covered on both sides by wall.
By wall. Yeah, no light coming in when we were in there before, and they just are beautiful pieces for that.
Nice.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. See that, and that's the stuff I guess that makes all of the effort and the difficulty and the frustration of having to restore a building, kind of worth it when you're finding cool things like that. All right, why don't we take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to learn more about the Coal Shed Brewery and the trials and tribulations that you folks had building what we know today as Mare Island Brewing Company. Hang in there. We'll be right back.
Ryan, it's your turn.
Okay, here comes a commercial. So, picture this. You're relaxing at the edge of a shimmering strait. A sailboat drifts by. You take a sip from an ice-cold beer. Picture yourself on an island escape. Picture yourself at Mare Island Brewing Company's Coal Shed Brewery. Resting on the scenic Mare Island waterfront, Mare Island Brewing Company's Coal Shed Brewery is a vacation from reality. Drink in the views, savor the brews, and get lost in 143 years of naval shipyard history. Escape to the island. Escape to Mare Island Brewing Company's Coal Shed Brewery. Oh, Max, that was beautiful.
That was lyrical.
I know. I thought here was going to be something
kind of a
tragic.
softball.
Yeah, I'll take it.
Welcome back to the Mare Island Brewing Podcast. We're in episode 3 here and learning all about the Coal Shed Brewery, where the Mare Island beer that you can find on the shelf or at the brewery itself is all made now. And we just talked to you sort of about how the historical significance of the area and the building and some of those hoops you had to jump through. How did you design, how did you get the brewery ready for the present day and for that matter, the future in an old building like that? After going through the hoops, after finding the right contractors, what's next?
Well, actually, it kind of back up a little even before that. We were originally in that space, as we said, and then the earthquake of August 2014 happened. We had just opened the Ferry Tap Room in July. 1 month later, that massive earthquake that shook the North Bay happened. And what happened is the coal shed, because of it being so old, there was some fissures that kind of opened up in the roof, and we saw some daylight through. And the developer actually came to us and said, "Hey, we've got to get you out of here."
Oh,
and so it was a little bit heartbreaking. I mean, again, we made the Coal Shed Stout. We had this vision of starting a brewery there, but they, no go. We had to get out of there, and so they moved us to. We settled on this building that was a 1985 tilt-up, metal sides, not sexy at all. Didn't have a story behind it.
Super functional, though.
Functional.
Okay,
absolutely functional. Bathrooms worked. And
it's a trade-off.
The space was smaller, and we actually started designing a brewery for that space because at the end of the day, we needed to make more beer.
I see.
And then, I don't know, it was about 2.5, 3 months after being in that space that the developer came back to us and said, "Hey, we actually want to fast track this development of the coal sheds. Would you guys consider going back into Coal Shed 151 and doing the brewery there?"
Wow.
So we actually pumped the brakes hard on building the brewery in the space we were and kind of came to the deal with the developer. And, it actually extended how long we had to continue doing contract brewing. But from that, I mean, it was well worth the wait for sure to be in the building we are now. I mean,
but that also must have been frustrating, kind of the back and forth.
Absolutely.
Like, why didn't you figure this out at first? I mean, I guess things come up, but
Sure.
You must have had a little moment there where you were like, what? Back and forth?
A lot of moments, but
Okay.
yes, for sure.
Okay.
Deflating, but we were determined. I mean, we were going to build this brewery in a 1985 non-sexy tilt-up to tell this story. So,
right.
The fact that we were able to get back into our original location and build the brewery we have is just, the developer is well powered through.
Okay.
We talked about this in the very first episode, if I remember right, is we had this great architect for our Ferry Tap Room, but he was a little old school, and he drew on tracing paper, and you'd lay the tracing paper over the older plans, and you would kind of do iterations that way, and then he'd eventually hand draw a whole new set of plans. This next time, we partnered up with this guy, Steve McMillan, who's a great architect.
Steve's great.
Steve's fantastic. And he's got Revit, which is, I don't know if it was new at the time, but it was certainly new to me. And it's a AutoCAD CAD drawing program. And he starts laying this thing out, and we would literally get on, it was pre-Zoom. It was like GoToMeeting or something was what it was called. And we would get on these meetings with him online, and he would have kind of the layout of the coal shed. And we'd be like, yeah, put this here, put this there, put this over here. And he was so fast. He could drop all this stuff in, and then it still blows my mind. I know this is like modern technology, but he could go to any point in the brewery and project what it would look like if you were to stand there and look in the angle. And so we'd be like, hey, give us this view, give us this view. Okay, move this over here, move the bar a little bit over here or whatever. It was the coolest collaborative, iterative thing, and we could literally envision what we were doing. And at the time, we were actually envisioning the end result of what we wanted to do someday. And we still haven't even done that at this point.
What a help that is, especially in a space like that.
Oh,
I mean, one of the things, of course, building your own brewery, we started talking to brewer friends we had. We started visiting breweries, trying to figure out, okay, what do we want? Where did you guys go wrong? What would you do if you could do it over again? And everybody, of course, said, build a bigger cold box, make sure you have enough space. And so, you hear stories of three guys and a gal getting together, putting all their money in. They've got this great recipe they want to do, build a brewery. They max out their credit cards, and they build the brewery they can. 2 months later, that IPA is gold medal here, and they can't produce it fast enough, and they've painted themselves in a corner. And so we wanted to make sure that we had the ability to be the 25, 50-year brand we wanted to be in this space. So we designed it for that 50-year look, 10-year look, wherever it ends up being, and then we subtracted that to what we started with. So the infrastructure, we made sure was all ready to be able to expand into.
I think, almost like archaeologists, if somebody came and Ryan and I weren't here and they looked at how our brewery is laid out, they'd be like, this doesn't really make any sense. I don't understand why you have it laid out this way. But as soon as we start taking out 15-barrel tanks and putting in 30-barrel tanks, and as soon as we want to start changing something around, it becomes extremely logical because we planned all this out long term, and then we just started subtracting away in the design.
Okay.
So that, our tanks were like really far apart when we first started because we were going to fill it in eventually with a slightly different size tank once we grew. And so we spent, 15-20% more in design than we needed to in order to try to future-proof this, if you will.
Well, and you might save 100 to 200% later down.
Absolutely.
So spend the 15 to 20.
And that was fun to just envision what it could be. And we still have those plans. We basically work off them at this point. And when we start doing improvements, like, all right, what was the master plan?
And how many barrel brew house do you have?
So we've got a 15-barrel brew house system that we got from Prospero, and that's kind of a funny point about the space is where that 15-barrel brew house sits, we actually designed it for a 30-barrel brew house to fit with 4-vessel and a much bigger system.
Okay.
And so I try to tell all the new brewers whenever we get one coming in, I was like, this dance floor right here, you don't really see in a lot of breweries, but the idea is there's space to grow in here. So our boiler, we oversized it for the 30-barrel brew house because it's like a $5,000 delta to get that one in instead of, the cost of getting the old one ripped out, selling that, the new one put in. And all of the glycol drops are already done from the initial construction. So it's been really easy to kind of just plug and play as we've expanded along the way.
And we bought a big cold box. We took everybody. That was actually our third cold box we had done. And we're like, all right, we're going to, whatever we thought we needed, we're going to add 50% to it. So we have this giant cold box room. And honestly, we could use a bigger one at this point.
And now I wish if you're out there building a brewery, thinking about it, bigger cold box, and make sure you can drive through it on both sides with a forklift or a van or whatever you need to. Because we have one door in and one door out, and it kind of gets a little tight.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And you still went 50% bigger than you thought.
Oh, I'd say at least.
Yeah. You guys do have a lot of space there, and I guess that's part of the, not just the history that you chose it for, but it's just a massive building for your size brewery right now, and will probably become, at least one day, maybe it's the 20-year plan, a rather small building for the size brewery you will have.
Another thing, we don't really know what's going to be around us as the developing happens. And so one of the things we built into this is a massive restaurant on the front end that has a mezzanine level with, kitchen downstairs, offices upstairs, and none of that is in place at this point. And so, if and when the development around us moves forward, we can either enact that plan or make the tap room a little smaller, make the brewery a little bigger. So we kind of have that ability to be a bit modular in the space. So.
You can drive yourself nuts, trying to think of all the what ifs. But I actually think we had a really good balance between, all right, let's plan for X, Y, and Z contingencies, but let's not drive ourselves nuts on this. But we literally have kind of a Mason-Dixon line, for lack of a better word, where if we want more front of house, we can move it a certain direction. If we want more back of house, we can move it the other direction. And we're just going to kind of take our lead from the developer and how they get things going around there as to what we do.
Sure. If you all of a sudden have a ton of, well, it wouldn't be sudden, but a ton of foot traffic out there, restaurant's the way to go.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And until then, keep that production brewery moving.
Yep.
That makes sense. Makes a lot of sense. So how long from the time that the developer came back and said, hey, would you like to move back in? And you say yes. Did you have a functioning brewery? I'm curious.
I think all in all, it had to be about 2 years because August 2014 was when that earthquake occurred. I'd say we were out of there by 1st of October, and then we didn't brew our first beer until June 2017.
2017, okay.
I mean, there was a lot of hurry up and wait, like in any kind of project. But we had to wait for the developer to tear the old space down, build the envelope, put the infrastructure in that we needed before we could even get our contractors in. Luckily, we actually partnered with the same contractor, so we were able to kind of have some things happen in conjunction. But yeah, ultimately it was about 2 years. So
and you have to, like, they're running into all kinds of problems as they're digging this. I mean, they're finding old cisterns and all this stuff. Like, I remember we had to have a sump so that all the effluent from all the floor drains and everything would flow into a sump and then get pumped up so that we could get enough gravity flow to get this off site. And we go to put in the sump, and the sump was a fiberglass.
It's 9 foot.
Yeah, it's 9 foot deep, right? And about 4 foot wide. Does that sound about right?
4 to 5 feet. Yeah, that sounds
yeah,
right.
and so think of it as like a giant fiberglass, like it looks like a cork, basically.
Yeah.
And so we dug out this hole, right, to put this thing in. Well, there's water just 3 or 4 feet under the ground. So every time we dig out the hole, there's all this water, just water tables right there.
Filling it in.
So we're trying to push this thing down in there, but it floats. And so every time we're trying to push it down, it's just floating back up. And so the way we finally got it in there is we put it in there, used the forklift and the weight of the forklift to push it down, which is kind of shoving water over, and then poured concrete all around it and then let it sit overnight. And that was the only way we could get this, airtight sump that was down there.
That's where we learned from our Navy forefathers. Just pour concrete in it. It'll be fine.
Just concrete it in.
It turns out they were right.
There was rebar in there this time, though.
And I don't know how deep we want to go on this, but if you're out there and you're building a brewery and you're listening to this one and you're trying to learn something, I have to tell you, effluent is the $64 question when you're building
Effluent. Yeah, that's all I can say.
Yeah,
I mean, and one of the things we ran into in Vallejo was they had never had a brewery before. And so we went in and we kind of pitched them on this, and their initial response was like, sure, go ahead and build it. Won't cost you anything on the effluent or whatever. And then it took us so long to kind of get there on this because we did that at first on the old building. And then this was like 3 years later that we finally get back to him. And when we go back to him, the guy we had talked to has retired. Some of the rules had changed. There's some new people in place. And like, oh yeah, you need to do this. And they hand us this basically sheet of paper, and they had gotten it from Fairfield, and Fairfield had forced that Budweiser plant in Fairfield to do.
Which is very different.
Which is just gigantic industrial user. And we're like, whoa, wait a minute on this thing, because we didn't really have any money budgeted for this.
Yeah.
Now, I find out it's more common. Like, most breweries deal with effluent issues. There's no doubt about it. So we got this system where, it all pumps up into this tank. It gets adjusted by pH based on, what the existing pH is. It goes into a meter and everything else. This system has been the most frustrating system, I think, that we've ever had. And Ryan's in the process of fixing it, frankly.
I mean, I have always been in the process of fixing it since 2017. I mean, one of the things, we stay in compliance for sure, but there's just always an add-on that we need. Like, for instance, when the effluent comes out, then there's some grain or some pieces of pallet that could get in it and gum up the pump. So we had to figure out a way to basically make a gold sluice that takes all of this solids out of there. And again, I could go on for another 3 podcasts about how much effluent I have to deal with. But I mean, again, it's part of the gig, and you definitely have to make sure that you're managing, your waste.
Well, in our I guess, defense, one of the things that turned out is we went through back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And we finally get it figured out with the sand and flood, how the system's going to be designed, how we're going to do it. And they're like, we need to show up and surprise you 2 times a quarter, I think it was, or at least 1 time a quarter.
Sure.
And do measurements and find out your total dissolved solids and your, biological oxygen demand. And so we're like, all right, sounds fine.
Yeah.
So they start, as soon as we get up and running, they come out, and the first they come out, we're not brewing that day. And so we don't really have anything flowing through there other than some people washing their hands or washing a tank or whatever. And they're like, hey, you're not creating enough for us to take the sample. And we're like, yeah, we tried to tell you we're not Budweiser. And they're like, well, how are we going to know when you're going to brew? And we're like, well, we can tell you. And they're like, well, then we wouldn't be surprising you. And I'm yeah, we got a bit of a catch-22 here, don't we? So
keep showing up.
They still show up. And honestly, they show up, and we're, on the days when we're going to brew, we kind of know they're coming. And most of the time they're measuring the stuff, and they're like, these measurements are so low.
Right.
That the change in your cost on what you're, because they change our cost based on our BOD and our TSS. And we're like, yeah, you're spending more coming out here and inspecting this than you are in the changing costs going on. But a little bit of Ryan found a way to sidestream a lot of our organic And I'm very proud of this. I mean, we've been working on sustainability really, really hard, particularly recently, but this is one of our earlier things. And we have a series of, who was the very first?
Gene. Yeah, I had Farmer Gene.
Rest in peace.
Yeah, Farmer Gene actually shares my birthday. We were a good kinship once we found that out. But Farmer Gene had a 100-head Black Angus cattle ranch in American Canyon. And, I was going around to everybody. Do you know any farmers? Do you know any farmers? We got to get rid of this spent grain.
Yeah.
And I went into our local welding shop, and they're like, I think I know a guy that actually has a farm, and gave me Gene's number. And one of the things that's really great about spent grain is it's got a kind of a high protein value for livestock, but we have to do something with it. So they've got a need, and we need to get rid of it. But some breweries will actually charge ranchers to take that spent grain, and I don't need to charge you. I need you to take it. So what we did is we now have these IBC totes that we collect all of our organics that come out, any of our yeast, any of our trube, anything that comes out of the kettle, and we side stream it into these IBC totes. And so part of the carrot and the stick is you get the grain, but you also got to take what we affectionately call the shit bins.
Yeah. Okay.
And what they end up doing with that is it's actually really high in nutrients that they're able to just spread it through the fields and till it in, and it actually really helps in growth in the fields. Fertilizing in essence. So, we're able to pull a lot of those organics out of the effluent stream to minimize our BODs, and it's those small things again that it's hard to tell the powers that be that this is actually way helping the process,
right?
But yet they come back and say we need to put a $6,000 multimeter in here to count everything, and
is it still once a quarter after they've seen the results for so long?
Now, because of our volume has increased, it's about two times a quarter.
Oh, so they didn't reduce it, even though you're okay.
I mean, they still have pencils. They still have pencils to push and boxes to check.
Exactly.
In their defense, we're right on the water on the Bay Area. Yeah. They have all these state regulations.
That's fair.
But I mean, there was this sort of incredulous moment where they were like, well, if you put some higher than 10 pH effluent down the system, which could happen if you were cleaning a tank and it kind of slugged through, that would kill the yeast in where we're doing all of our processing treatment. But I was like, that's 4 miles downstream, and you got 70,000 households that are feeding into it. If you think we're going to send a pH of 10 slug that's going to kill your, this calculation doesn't make any sense. But they have very strict rules that they have to follow. And I here's my recommendation to anybody who is looking at building a brewery. Very first question I tell them to ask them is go sit down with sand and flood, because that is likely going to be the biggest single issue you're going to have. You can always take care of seismic. You can always fill everything else. Maybe water, you should talk to them, make sure there's enough water there. But effluent is where you're going to make or break your build out.
Sounds about right.
And I want to make sure we have a great standing relationship with Sand and Flood of Vallejo. They do work with us and everything. It's just was the unknown when you're writing out a budget. You're thinking of the tanks, the mill, the auger, everything else, canning line. But the effluent side of life is a big budget item.
And it's become more so over the years. So I think it's excellent that you guys are pointing it out, because I do think a decade ago it wasn't as much as it is now.
Right.
Certainly not 2 decades ago.
I mean, certainly if you are thinking of building a brewery, maybe the municipality you build it in, start with Sand and Flood, like Kent said, because that you might choose one city over the other depending on what restrictions that they put upon you.
Agreed.
Sure.
Yeah.
What about moving? So up until this point, when you open your contract brewing at different people's breweries, different people's water sources, things like that. Now you've got your own brewery. So not only do you have to learn your own brew system, which that's been covered in all kinds of podcasts, but what about new water, new ingredients? Like what's your experience with that location there?
Well, one of the things, and the reason why we actually decided on the Prospero Brew House that we had is Strike Brewing Company has the same one, and so I had been down there, worked with them on that one, and was really familiar. So actually, the brewing on the new system was a little bit easier.
Nice.
Definitely the water was one that we had to kind of figure out, and come to find out, how much, what is it, like 90% of your beers or the ingredients in beer is water.
Yep.
So if you don't get that water figured out, you're not going to ever make a great beer. So one of the things in Vallejo is we actually have really good water sources.
Okay.
It harks back to the Navy where they had water grants, and we get our water from...
Well, we actually... I mean, it gets more complicated than that. I mean, the style of water you have dictates the style of beer. I mean, in modern technology, we can... reverse osmosis our way out of that or whatever. But we had done water analysis. We're like, oh, this is perfect for this kind of style of beer. We're going to kind of, aim for that and work around that or whatever. And then we did another water analysis after we'd already kind of ordered some tanks and some equipment, and it comes back completely different. And we're like, what the hell's going on here? And so I was on this water rate board committee that the city had asked if I would be willing to sit on. And I go back, I happen to know the people at the water, but I go back to them like, hey, what's going on here between these two reports? Like, oh, well, we have amazing water rights. We have 3 times more water than Vallejo actually needs. We have water rights too. We sell our water rights to other people. However, we have 3 different sources. We have a surface level source up in Napa. We get it out of the North Bay Aqueduct. And there's one other,
something out in the Delta.
Yeah, it's escaping me at this point. There's one other source, and they're very different consistencies, this water. And I'm like, well, we're trying to brew with this. How are we going to know what's coming on? I'm like, well, that's a little tough because at 2:00 we might be on this source and we might throw the switch, and at 2:30 we might be on this source, and then we might be 50-50. And I'm like, Ryan, man, we are in trouble.
And then we're trying to figure out, okay, well then how far down the trunk line are we? Yeah. What do we need to know? Yeah. And so kind of back to your original question, it became very clear that we needed to reverse osmosis our water. So basically strip it down and get the minerals to a baseline, and then we add the minerals back in the mash.
Just to help those of your listeners who are not beer aficionados or don't know the brewing process, just the very briefest of history lessons. The styles of beer that historically were dictated by the water that was present. So a porter had, it was an English water source, the Burton-on-Trent, it's known as, and the minerals in that water just naturally, because back then we didn't really adjust them, happened to produce a wonderful porter. A Czech-style Pilsner, the reason we know that as kind of a not too bitter and sort of a pillowy, flowery Pilsner is the water that was present in Czech at the time. And the same goes for German styles and English styles and all the way across the board. So what these guys are talking about is water matters. And it used to just be historically significant. You didn't build a brewery. If you wanted to be a stout brewery, you didn't brew it in Pilsner water. Right. It just you couldn't change it. Well, now we can change it. Yeah. And so that's what Ryan was just saying, is that you can strip it all down and then put back the solids that you want that mimic these historical styles.
Right.
Fair enough?
Beautifully said.
That was brilliant. That's a brilliant description.
Just try to be, I've been doing that for years.
I just learned a little something there. So.
No, and you have the issue similar to the floors when they said, no, there's no rebar in there. When we found out there was different water sources, like, well, we didn't have a line item in the budget for a reverse osmosis system, and we needed a giant tank to hold it. We needed a place on there. So we're back to, designing that. So that was another one of the sort of hiccups we ran into right in the middle. So after you talk to Sand and Flood when you're building your brewery, go talk to your local water department, get an analysis, and make sure it's the same water source that they're using, or plan for reverse osmosis.
Right. Yeah. I knew a brewery in Napa, Downtown Joe's. Great little
Colin.
place. And Colin, I don't think he's there anymore, but he was there for so long. And he taught me the same thing about their water source there, is that he would say, oh yeah, no, it's different every day. I have to check it every day and see what I'm getting. And I don't know that he ever reverse osmosis or not, or he just kept building and deconstructing. But he said one of the biggest challenges there was the 3 water sources.
I mean, thankfully we figured this out during the design aspect of it. And, we were able to continue talking to the bank about the different kind of line item changes we've had. And, just getting this stuff understood before you even get to the design aspect you're going to be way ahead of the game.
All right. So you go through all this trouble, but now you got yourselves a brewery and you're making yourself some beer and you spend some money to get your water right. What are we looking at today?
Well, I mean, it is a beautiful 8,000 square foot historic coal shed on the waterfront. I said to our wholesale reps, I said, if you just get any of your clients back to the coal shed brewery, you're sold. You're in the middle of that history. And, I think we've done a damn good job of keeping it simple, but also just really functional of a brewery with the waterfront aspect of it.
Yeah. And if you come, there's a breezeway as you're entering in, and in that breezeway, the foundation itself has put up a series of posters that show pictures of the coal shed before all this happened. And so you can see both historically and just before it was built kind of what it looked like. But we have a food truck out there which we own because it was hard to put a kitchen in there. Again, that's kind of a future thing that we're going to do. And we do events at this area, and we're hopping particularly on weekends. And we even do lunch during the week for the 2,000-3,000 people that work on the island at this point. And it's it's not super polished. We're just still kind of waiting for what's going to happen around us, but you're sitting there looking out on the water. You can't really beat it with a pint in your hand. So we certainly invite you down.
And one of the things I can say as being a father and a parent is that it's very family friendly. You have the waterfront as far as a fence that keeps anybody from going over the edge, and then a nice little space between our fence and that waterfront where kids will come out and ride their bikes around. Out there drawing with chalk, and while the parents are enjoying pints, the parents are corralled and the kids are having a little more time out there. But it's very dog friendly. It's just a really nice open air waterfront experience at a brewery. And again, all of that history is just around you. You can't help but just feel it when you're there.
I've been there, and I concur. It's just a beautiful spot to sit. I love being on the water in any way, shape, or form, and that's just a really good place to do it with a nice pint in your hand. Well, thanks, guys, not only for teaching me about building the brewery, but thank you for building the brewery, because it's producing some good beer and a cool spot to hang out.
All right, I got a question for Ryan before we sign off.
Okay.
Is that all right?
Absolutely.
I think it's an easy one for you. You may have already addressed it, but because we were talking about the Coal Shed, I wanted to know, now that we have been brewing for all these years at the Coal Shed, what is the one thing about our design? What is the most important thing about our design that if we could go back in time and change it, that you would change it?
I think I actually may have already said it with that cold box, is making it drive-through. Just being able to have 2 entrances or exits on it. And again, I'd still make it a little bigger. I'd still make it a little bigger. Yeah.
You had asked me last podcast about, this moment I told you about Kieran and his tattoo on his shoulder. I'll come in at 6:30 in the morning, and Kieran has to tear that cold box, all that inventory out, so he can get to that 1/6 of Survivor's Tale Pale Ale that's in the back. And I'm with you. If we just had it set up so you could drive through it and pull things off of gorilla racks on either side, and this thing is huge. So
yeah,
it's funny. As I was asking that question, that was the first thing that was going through my mind too.
Yeah. Maybe, I don't know, and maybe a hot tub. That would have been nice. Hot tub would be nice.
I like that.
There's still time for that.
Yeah,
I feel like.
For sure. We've got the plumbing.
All right, gentlemen. Well, thank you so much. Next up on the Mare Island Brewing Company podcast, we're going to talk about the cast of characters that helped launch Mare Island Brewing Company. Sometimes they hindered, always helped, always entertained, all along the journey of building Mare Island Brewing Company. So that's coming up next on the podcast. Ryan, thanks, bud.
Thank you, guys.
Ken, good to learn from you every time.
Thank you.
All right, we'll see you next time on Battleships to Beer, 10 years of Mare Island Brewing Company. If you want to see historical and other photos to events referenced in this podcast, head on over to the Mare Island Brewing Company website at mareislandbrewingco.com or check out the link in the show notes for this episode.